"You look exhausted," Mafia boss said as she slept on his shoulder, then took her to his mansion. The smell of lemon-scented industrial cleaner was the only thing keeping Isla Moreno awake, and even that was losing its battle against the gravity pulling at her eyelids. It was 2 a.m. in Chicago, and the neon sign of the 24-hour diner where she worked hummed with a low, irritating buzz that seemed to vibrate in her molars. She wiped down the counter for the 100th time that night, her wrist aching with a dull, repetitive throb. The rag was gray, the water in the bucket was lukewarm, and the tips in her pocket amounted to less than $12 for a 6-hour shift. This was the second half of her day. The first half had been spent on her knees scrubbing grout in a motel off the interstate, a place where people paid by the hour and left their shame in the bed sheets. Isla had scrubbed until her knuckles were raw and red, only to rush across the city to put on an apron and pour coffee for truck drivers and insomniacs who barely looked her in the eye. Isla moved toward the kitchen to dump the bucket, her legs feeling heavy, as if she were wading through waist-deep water. She caught her reflection in the stainless steel pie case. Her dark hair was pulled back in a fraying, messy bun, escaping strands sticking to her forehead with sweat. There were dark, violet bruises of exhaustion under her eyes, stark against her pale skin. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. Her manager, a thick-necked man named Rick, who smelled perpetually of stale fryer grease and cigarettes, leaned out of the service window. He did not speak. He barked. He told her she missed a spot on table 4. He told her she was moving too slow. He told her that there were plenty of girls desperate for work who would not drag their feet like she did. Isla nodded, accepting the verbal lashing with a numbness that had become her armor. She did not argue. She could not afford to argue. 2 years ago, she might have snapped back. 2 years ago, she'd been a different person, wearing designer heels and worrying about final exams at the university. That was before the sirens, the early morning raid, and the image of her father being led away in handcuffs while the neighbors watched from behind their curtains. Fraud, the prosecutors had said, embezzlement on a massive scale. Her father had sworn he was innocent, that he had been set up by partners who needed a fall guy, but the gavel had come down all the same. The assets were frozen, then seized. The house was gone. The friends who used to drink his wine and laugh at his jokes stopped answering their phones. Isla had been left with nothing but a blackened reputation and a suitcase of clothes she could no longer afford to dry clean. Now, she was just the girl who cleaned up other people's messes. Rick dismissed her 10 minutes late, docking her pay for a break she had not taken. Isla changed out of her uniform in the cramped bathroom, pulling on a thick, oversized sweater and a coat that was not warm enough for the biting November wind waiting outside. She exited the diner through the back alley to avoid the drunk patrons lingering near the front, clutching her purse tight against her chest. The walk to the train station was a gauntlet of shadows and steam rising from manhole covers. The city felt predatory at this hour. The wind whipped off the lake, cutting through the alleys like a knife, stinging her cheeks and making her eyes water. She kept her head down, walking with a brisk, purposeful stride that she hoped masked her terror. She was squatting in a condemned apartment building 4 stops away, a place with no heat and a landlord who accepted cash under the table while looking at her with eyes that made her skin crawl. She had to be careful. She had to be invisible. The station was a cavern of fluorescent light and concrete. Isla swiped her pass, the turnstile clicking loudly in the empty silence. She moved to the platform, shivering, and wrapped her arms around herself. When the train finally rumbled into the station, screeching metal against metal, it looked like a haven. She stepped into the car and scanned it quickly. It was mostly empty, save for a few slumped figures in the far back and a group of men sitting near the middle. She chose a seat near the door, collapsing onto the hard plastic bench. The heat in the car was blasted high, a stark contrast to the freezing air outside. It wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, instantly seducing her tired body into a state of dangerous relaxation. Isla tried to keep her eyes open. She focused on the grime on the window, on the rhythmic clatter of the wheels over the tracks, on the flickering overhead light, but the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, pulling her chin toward her chest. She blinked, and the world blurred. She blinked again, and the train car seemed to tilt. She did not realize she was falling. She simply drifted, her body surrendering to the overwhelming need for rest, her head lolled to the side, seeking something to lean on, something solid. She found a shoulder. It was broad, firm, and covered in wool so soft it felt like velvet against her cheek. It smelled of expensive things, sandalwood, aged leather, and a hint of cigar smoke that was not stale, but rich and earthy. It was the most comfortable thing she had felt in months. Isla let out a soft, ragged sigh, her hand curling unconsciously into the fabric of the stranger's coat as she slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. Beside her, Luca Belanti did not move. He sat perfectly still, his posture rigid, his dark eyes fixed on the reflection in the window opposite him. He was a man who occupied space with terrifying authority. His suit was custom-tailored Italian wool, charcoal gray, fitting his broad frame with architectural precision. A black overcoat was draped over his shoulders, the very coat the girl was currently drooling on. Across the aisle, two of his men sat tense and alert. One of them, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, started to rise, his hand drifting toward the inside of his jacket. He glared at the girl who had dared to use the dawn of the Belanti crime family as a travel pillow. Luca raised a single finger. The gesture was small, barely a twitch, but it froze his man instantly. The guard sat back down, confusion flickering in his eyes, but he did not question the order. Luca looked down at the girl. She was small, fragile-looking, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of a bone-deep weariness he recognized. He knew what it looked like to be hunted by life. He had seen that look in the mirror enough times. Her hand was gripping his lapel, her fingers red from the cold and rough from work. She looked nothing like the women he usually associated with. Polished, dangerous creatures who wanted his money or his power. She looked like a stiff breeze could shatter her. He should have shoved her off. He should have moved seats. He was Luca Belanti, a man who was currently navigating a violent turf war that had left 3 of his warehouses in ashes. He was not a pillow for stray kittens, but as the train rattled through the darkness of the Chicago underground, he remained statue still, adjusting his shoulders slightly so her head would not slip. The train screeched to a halt at her stop, the sudden deceleration jolting Isla awake. She gasped, her eyes flying open. For a second, she did not know where she was. Then the smell of sandalwood hit her, and she realized she was practically draped over a stranger. Isla scrambled back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Oh, God," she breathed, her voice thick with sleep. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I just closed my eyes for a second." She looked up, and the apology died in her throat. The man she had been sleeping on was terrifying. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, angular features and eyes the color of obsidian. But there was a coldness radiating from him that made the air in the train car feel thin. He looked at her with an expression she could not read, not anger, not amusement, just an intense, calculating assessment. And then she saw the men across the aisle. They were staring at her with the predatory focus of wolves waiting for a command to strike. Panic surged through her. "I'm sorry," she repeated, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed her bag, her hands shaking. "Excuse me." The doors chimed and slid open. Isla bolted. She stepped out onto the platform, the cold air hitting her sweat-dampened skin, and walked as fast as her tired legs could carry her toward the exit turnstiles. She needed to get out. She needed to disappear. Footsteps echoed behind her. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. She did not look back. She pushed through the turnstile and hurried up the concrete stairs to the street level. The neighborhood here was rough, a grid of broken streetlights and boarded-up storefronts. It was late, silent and dangerous. "Miss?" The voice was deep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the pavement. It was not a shout, but it carried effortless authority. Isla froze near the top of the stairs. She turned slowly. The man from the train stood 10 feet away. He had buttoned his coat, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. His men were nowhere to be seen. which somehow made him more intimidating. He was alone, yet he occupied the street as if he owned the concrete itself. "You forgot this," he said. He held out a scarf, a cheap, fraying wool thing she had bought at a thrift store. It must have fallen when she scrambled up. Isla stared at it, then at him. "Thank you," she whispered. She reached out, snatched the scarf, and turned to leave again. "I have to go. Walking alone out here is not smart," he said. His tone was flat, stating a fact rather than offering an opinion. "I am fine," Isla lied, her voice trembling. "I live just around the corner." "You are lying," he said. He took a step closer, and the light from a flickering street lamp cast his face in sharp relief. "You hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. You looked left, then right, like a prey animal checking for predators. You still have a walk to go still." Isla bristled, fear giving way to a spark of defensive anger. "That is none of your business." "It becomes my business when you use my coat as a mattress," he replied smoothly. There was no mockery in his voice, only a strange, calm persistence. "I will walk you to your door." "No," Isla said quickly. "I don't know you." "And you don't know them either," Lucas said, nodding his head slightly toward the other side of the street. Isla looked. In the shadow of a closed liquor store, 3 men were standing, watching them. They were not the man's bodyguards, they were locals, hooded and shifting their weight with the restless energy of trouble looking for a place to happen. One of them flicked a cigarette onto the sidewalk and took a step forward. Eyes locked on Isla. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She knew this neighborhood. She knew what happened in the dead zones between streetlights. She looked back at the man in the suit. He was dangerous. Yes, every instinct she had screamed that he was an apex predator. But the men across the street felt like hyenas, messy, chaotic, and cruel. The man in the suit felt controlled. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Let's just say I have some time to kill," he said. He extended an elbow, a gesture of old-world manners that looked bizarrely out of place in the grime of the street. "Shall we?" Isla hesitated for one heartbeat more, then stepped to his side. She did not take his arm, keeping a foot of distance between them. "It is 4 blocks down, the brick building with the blue door." It was a lie. She lived 8 blocks away in a crumbling tenement that barely had a door, let alone a blue one. But she was not going to lead this man to where she slept. They began to walk. The silence between them was heavy. Isla was hyper-aware of his presence. He walked with a fluid grace, his head up, scanning the environment without seeming to look at anything at all. The sound of his dress shoes on the pavement was a rhythmic counterpoint to the scuffing of her worn-out sneakers. "You work late," he observed after a block. It wasn't a question. 2 jobs, Isla said, keeping her eyes straight ahead. "Rent does not pay itself." "What is the second one? The one that makes you smell like bleach?" Isla flushed, embarrassment heating her neck. She tried to pull her coat tighter, as if to hide the scent of her poverty. "Motel housekeeping. Honest work," he said. There was no judgment in his tone, which surprised her. Men like him usually looked at women like her as if they were part of the scenery, or worse, something to be used and discarded. "You looked like you hadn't slept in a week back there." "It has been a long month," she admitted, the fatigue creeping back into her voice. "Trouble at home?" "Something like that." She glanced at him sideways. "You ask a lot of questions to a stranger." "I find that people are more interesting when they think no one is watching," he said enigmatically. They crossed an intersection. The streetlights here were broken, plunging the block into near total darkness. Isla instinctively moved closer to him. The shadows felt thick. Concealing movement behind them. The scuff of a boot on gravel echoed. Isla stiffened. "Someone is following us." "I know," Lucas said softly. He did not speed up. He did not look back. "Keep walking." "But keep walking." They took another 10 steps. The footsteps behind them quickened, heavy and clumsy. A voice rang out, raspy and aggressive. "Hey, rich boy!" Isla stopped, her breath hitching. She turned. It was one of the men from the liquor store. He had followed them, emboldened by the darkness and the expensive cut of Luca's suit. He was holding something in his hand, a knife. glinting dully in the ambient light of the city. "Wallet and the watch," the thug sneered, stepping closer. "And the girl leaves her purse, too." Isla backed away, her hands coming up in a defensive posture. "Please," she stammered. "We don't have anything." The thug ignored her, focusing on Luca. "You deaf? I said give me the watch." Luca turned slowly. He did not look afraid. He looked bored. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with deliberate slowness, sighing as if this were a tedious meeting he had to attend. "Go home," Luca said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a menacing weight that made the air drop 10 degrees. "Last chance." The thug laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. He lunged, the knife slashing out in a clumsy arc. Isla screamed. What happened next was a blur of motion too fast for Isla to fully comprehend. Luca did not retreat. He stepped into the attack. His left hand shot out, catching the thug's wrist in midair. There was a sickening crack, the sound of bones snapping under immense pressure, followed immediately by the clatter of the knife hitting the pavement. The thug howled. Dropping to his knees, Luca did not stop. He twisted the man's arm behind his back and drove a knee into his ribs, forcing him face first onto the concrete. It was brutal, efficient, and completely silent on Luca's part. He didn't grunt with effort. He didn't shout in anger. He simply dismantled the threat as if he were taking apart a broken clock. He leaned down, whispering something into the ear of the groaning man. Isla couldn't hear the words, but she saw the thug go completely still, paralyzed by sheer terror. Luca stood up, adjusting his cuffs. He looked down at the man, then kicked the knife into a storm drain. He turned back to Isla. She was pressing herself against the brick wall of a building, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. She'd seen violence before, fights in the diner, police raids, but she had never seen violence like this. This was professional. This was practiced. Luca walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. He did not look triumphant. He looked concerned. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Isla shook her head, unable to find her voice. She looked at his hands. They were clean. No blood, just perfectly manicured nails and knuckles that didn't even look red. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. The wind howled down the alley, blowing Isla's hair across her face. Luca reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm, and the touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. He looked into her eyes, his expression softening just a fraction, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the monster. "Someone who doesn't like seeing women sleep on trains," he replied simply. Isla stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The thug on the ground groaned, dragging himself away into the shadows, but Isla didn't look at him. She couldn't look away from Luca. "Come," he said, offering his elbow again as if the violence of the last 30 seconds had never happened. "We are almost to the blue door." Isla looked at his arm. She looked at the darkness surrounding them. And then, driven by an instinct she couldn't name, she stepped forward and wrapped her hand around his arm. It was hard as rock beneath the soft wool. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the echo of their footsteps the only sound in the sleeping city. But this time, Isla didn't feel the cold. She felt the heat radiating from the man beside her, a dangerous fire that she knew she should run from, but which she was inexplicably drawn toward. They stood in front of the weathered brick building Isla had claimed was her home. The wind was still biting, whipping down the canyon of the street, but the presence of Luca Belanti seemed to act as a shield against the cold. He did not look at the building, nor did he question why a young woman would live in a place where the windows were boarded up with plywood on the first floor. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a small, rectangular card. He held it out to her. Isla took it, her fingers brushing against his leather glove. The card was heavy, matte black, and completely blank on one side. On the other, embossed in silver leaf, was a single telephone number. No name, no business title, no address. "If the wolves come back," Luca said, his voice low and devoid of the mockery she was used to hearing from men in this neighborhood, You call this? Isla looked at the card, then up at him. I do not need charity. It is not charity, he corrected, his dark eyes locking onto hers. It is insurance. Good night. Miss Moreno. He knew her last name. She had not told him her name. Before she could ask how he knew, he turned and walked away, moving with that same silent, predatory grace back toward the shadows where the city seemed to swallow him whole. Isla watched him go until he was nothing but a silhouette against the streetlights. Then she pushed open the heavy front door of the building. She waited in the vestibule for 5 minutes, counting the seconds to ensure he was truly gone. Then, shivering, she slipped back out, staying close to the walls, and began the 8-block trek to her real apartment. As she walked, she looked at the black card in her hand. It felt heavy, like a stone. It represented a world she did not understand and a man who frightened her just as much as he intrigued her. She passed a garbage can overflowing with wet cardboard and soda bottles. With a sudden burst of resolve, she tossed the card inside. She did not need a savior, especially not one who broke arms without blinking. She was Isla Moreno. She survived. But as she walked another 10 steps, her resolve crumbled. The image of the thug's face when Luca twisted his arm, the sheer terror in his eyes, flashed in her mind. She stopped, cursing softly under her breath. She dug a crumpled receipt and a pen from her purse. She did not go back for the card, but she squeezed her eyes shut, visualizing the silver numbers she had stared at for those 5 minutes in the vestibule. She wrote the sequence down on the back of the receipt, shoved it deep into her pocket, and hurried home. The next day was a lesson in humiliation. The motel where Isla worked the morning shift was a festering sore on the side of the highway, a place where truckers and desperate couples stopped for an hour or two. The air always smelled of stale smoke and industrial bleach, a combination that made Isla's stomach turn. She was scrubbing the grout of room 112 when the guest returned. He was a large man with a red face and wandering eyes, and he had not checked out yet. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light, watching her on her hands and knees. "You missed a spot," he drawled. Stepping into the room, Isla sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. "I'm just finishing up, sir. If you could give me 5 minutes." "I don't have 5 minutes," he said, taking a step closer. "But maybe we can work something out. You look like a girl who knows how to make a man comfortable." Isla stood up, clutching her spray bottle like a weapon. "Please move," he laughed, reaching out to grab her wrist. Isla jerked back, the bottle slipping from her wet hand and clattering to the floor. "Don't touch me!" "Hey!" The shout came from the hallway. It was her manager, a wiry man named Gary who sweated profusely regardless of the temperature. He stormed in, looking from the guest to Isla. "What is going on here?" Gary demanded. "This girl is crazy," the guest lied smoothly, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I asked for extra towels and she started screaming at me. Throw the bottle, too." Isla's jaw dropped. "That is not true. He tried to—" "Enough," Gary snapped. He turned to Isla, his face twisting with annoyance. "This is the 3rd complaint this month. Isla, you are here to clean, not cause drama. Apologize to the gentleman." Isla stared at him. The injustice of it burned in her throat like acid. "I will not—" "Then you can clock out," Gary said, pointing a shaking finger at the door. "And don't bother coming back tomorrow unless you learn how to treat paying customers with respect." Isla walked out. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. She walked 3 miles to her second job at the diner, only to find that her shift had been cut because business was slow. By the time she reached her apartment building that night, her bones felt like they were made of lead. All she wanted was to crawl onto her mattress, pull the thin blanket over her head, and sleep until the world ended. She climbed the 4 flights of stairs, the smell of boiled cabbage and mildew thick in the stairwell. When she reached her door, she retrieved her key and slid it into the lock. It did not turn. Isla frowned, jiggling it. She pulled it out, wiped it on her shirt, and tried again. It stopped halfway. The lock was new. The brass was shiny, contrasting with the peeling paint of the door. "Trouble with the key?" Isla spun around. Her landlord stood at the end of the hallway, leaning against the railing. He was a greasy man who wore gold chains that turned his neck green and looked at Isla with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "The key doesn't work," Isla said, her voice trembling slightly. "That is because I changed the cylinder about an hour ago," he said, picking his teeth with a fingernail. "You are 3 weeks late on rent." Isla, "I have half of it," she pleaded, reaching for her purse. "I can give you half now, and the rest on Friday when I get my tips from the diner." "I don't want a half," he said, pushing off the railing and walking slowly toward her. "And I am tired of waiting for cash, but there are other ways to pay." He stopped a foot away from her, his gaze raking over her body in a way that made Isla feel naked. The hallway suddenly felt very small, the air very thin. "Open the door," Isla said, her voice hard. "Or what?" he sneered. "You are squatting here. Sweetheart, you are not on the lease. I call the cops. You go to jail for trespassing, unless you want to come downstairs to my unit and negotiate." He reached for her. Isla did not think. She reacted. She slammed her purse into his chest, driving him back a step, and then she turned and ran. She scrambled down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, hearing his angry shouts echoing behind her. She burst out of the front door and into the street. It had started to rain, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked through her sweater in seconds. Isla ran until her lungs burned, turning corners at random, putting distance between herself and the landlord. She stopped under the awning of a closed laundromat, gasping for air. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. She had nowhere to go, no money for a hotel, no friends to call. Her father was in prison. Her mother was dead. She was completely, utterly alone in a city that wanted to eat her alive. She sank to the ground, wrapping her arms around her knees. She reached into her pocket to find a tissue, but her fingers brushed against a piece of paper. The receipt. She pulled it out. The ink was smudged from the rain, but the silver numbers she had scribbled down were still legible. Isla stared at them. It was a lifeline, or it was a trap. At this moment, soaking wet and terrified, the difference didn't seem to matter. There was a payphone on the corner. She walked to it, her legs numb. She fed her last few quarters into the slot and dialed the number with trembling fingers. It rang once. "Tell me where you are." The voice was deep, calm, and instantly recognizable. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't say hello. He just knew. Isla let out a sob she had been holding back for hours. I am at the laundromat on 5th and Main. Please, stay there." The line went dead. Isla hung up the phone and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. She began to wonder if he was coming, or if this was some cruel joke. Then a car turned the corner. It was a black sedan, sleek and long, moving through the rain-slicked streets like a phantom. It pulled up to the curb right in front of her. The window rolled down. Luca sat in the driver's seat. He was alone. He wore a black turtleneck that emphasized the sharp line of his jaw, and the interior of the car glowed with the soft light of the dashboard. Isla stepped forward, hugging herself. "I don't have any money," she blurted out, the rain dripping from her nose. If you expect payment, I can't." Luca looked at her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her shivering form. He reached across the passenger seat and pushed the door open. "Get in," he said. Isla looked at the open door, then back at the dark, empty street. She got in. The car was warm and smelled of leather and that same sandalwood scent. It was silent, the engine barely a hum. Isla buckled her seatbelt, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Luca put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small. "Somewhere safe," he replied. He drove for 30 minutes, leaving the grimy grid of the city behind and heading toward the affluent northern suburbs, where the houses sat behind high iron gates. They wound up a private drive lined with ancient oaks, finally stopping in front of a massive limestone mansion. It was beautiful, but it was cold. The architecture was severe, all sharp angles and imposing columns. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Luca parked the car and led her inside. The foyer was cavernous, with floors of black and white marble that shone like glass. A grand staircase swept upward, and a crystal chandelier hung overhead, unlit. The silence in the house was absolute. "You are soaked," Luca observed, looking at the puddle forming around her sneakers. "I'm sorry about the floor," Isla murmured. "The floor is stone. It will survive." He gestured toward the stairs. "Second floor, third door on the left. It is a guest suite. There are fresh towels and clothes in the closet. Sleep." Isla hesitated. "You live here alone?" "Go," he said, not unkindly. She went. The room was larger than her entire apartment. It had a 4-poster bed, a fireplace, and a bathroom stocked with soaps that smelled of lavender. Isla stripped off her wet clothes, showered in water that was blessedly hot, and climbed into the bed. She expected to lie awake, terrified, but the mattress was like a cloud. She was asleep before her head fully settled on the pillow. Isla woke to sunlight streaming through heavy velvet curtains. For a moment, she panicked, not recognizing the ornate molding on the ceiling. Then the memory of the night before rushed back. She sat up. She was wearing a silk oversized shirt she had found in the closet. The door to her room opened softly, and a middle-aged woman in a gray uniform entered carrying a tray. "Good morning, miss," the woman said with a polite smile. "I brought you coffee and toast. Mr. Belanti thought you might be hungry." "Where is he?" Isla asked, pulling the sheet up to her chin. "Mr. Belanti is out of business," the maid said, setting the tray on the nightstand. "He said you were to make yourself at home, but he asked that you not leave the grounds." Isla nodded slowly. "Thank you." After the maid left, Isla ate quickly, the food reviving her. She dressed in a pair of cashmere leggings and a sweater she found in the wardrobe, clearly bought for someone else, or kept for guests, but they fit well enough. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was vast and silent. She wandered down the corridor, her bare feet making no sound on the thick runners. She tried a door handle. Locked. She tried another. Locked. She went downstairs. The library was open. It was a beautiful room, lined floor to ceiling with books, but as she walked around, she noticed things that didn't fit. A drawer in the mahogany desk was slightly ajar, revealing the matte black grip of a handgun. On the mantelpiece, between antique clocks, a small, discreet camera lens blinked with a red light, following her movement. In the kitchen, she found another camera above the refrigerator. In the foyer, a panel by the door had a keypad with more buttons than a standard alarm system. This was not just a house, it was a compound. Isla spent the day in the library, reading to keep her mind off the fear gnawing at her gut. Who was this man? Why had he brought her here? And what was the price going to be? Dusk fell, painting the house in long shadows. The front door opened, the heavy thud echoing through the hall. Isla froze. Steps approached the library. Luca appeared in the doorway. He looked tired. His tie was loosened, and there was a bruise blooming on his knuckles that hadn't been there the night before. "Dinner is served in the dining room," he said, his voice rough. "Join me." Isla followed him. The dining table was long enough to seat 20 people, but it was set for 2 at one end. A simple meal of steak and roasted vegetables was waiting. Luca sat at the head of the table, pouring himself a glass of dark red wine. He gestured for her to sit. Isla sat. She didn't eat. She watched him. He ate with mechanical precision, cutting the meat and chewing slowly, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "You have questions," he said after a few minutes, not looking at her. "I can hear you thinking from here." Isla took a breath. "Are you in the Mafia?" Luca stopped chewing. He set his knife and fork down, picked up his wine glass, and took a sip. He turned his gaze to her, and the intensity of it made her breath hitch. He didn't lie. He didn't laugh it off. "I run things," he said calmly. "I ensure order where there is chaos. I protect what is mine. That is all you need to know." Isla's hands clenched in her lap. "Is that what I am now? Something you own?" "You are a guest," Luca said. "You can leave whenever you want. But if you walk out that door, the landlord, the debts, the people who put your father in prison, they are all still there waiting for you." "Why?" Isla asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you help me? You don't know me. I am nobody." I fell asleep on your shoulder and drooled on your coat. Why bring me here? Why give me clothes and food?" Luca looked at her for a long time. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. For a second, the mask slipped. The cold, imperious Mafia boss faded, and Hila saw a flash of something ancient and incredibly lonely in his eyes. "Because," Luca said quietly, his voice sounding hollow in the massive room, "because no one helped me once." He picked up his knife and fork and resumed eating. The conversation was over, but the air between them had shifted. Hila picked up her fork, her hand trembling, and took a bite. She was terrified. Yes. But as she looked at the man eating alone at the head of the table, she realized she wasn't just afraid of him. She was aching for him. 5 days had passed since Isla Moreno disappeared from the gritty reality of her life and reappeared inside the limestone walls of Luca Belanti's estate. The mansion was less of a home and more of a fortress disguised as a palace. It was a place of hushed acoustics and cold surfaces, where the air always smelled faintly of lemon oil and beeswax. Hila moved through the rooms like a ghost, unsure of her own substance. She was not a prisoner. The heavy oak front door was never locked from the inside. Yet, she was certainly not a guest in the traditional sense. Guests were invited for parties or dinners. They were not plucked from rain-swept streets and given wardrobes full of silk and cashmere. She felt more like a stray cat that had been taken in by an apex predator, tolerated, fed, and watched with unblinking intensity. Luca was a phantom in his own house. He left before she woke, his black sedan crunching down the gravel drive while the morning mist still clung to the manicured lawns. He returned long after the sun had set, bringing with him the scent of the city, exhaust, cold air, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. He provided everything she could possibly need. The refrigerator was stocked with her favorite foods, though she had never told him what they were. A stack of paperback novels appeared on her nightstand one afternoon. Fresh flowers, white lilies were placed in the foyer daily, but he gave her nothing of himself. When their paths crossed in the hallway or the kitchen, he offered a polite nod or a brief inquiry about her comfort, his face a mask of perfect, impenetrable marble. Hila's curiosity began to gnaw at her fear. She started to pay attention to the rhythm of the house. She noticed that the landline phone in the study rang at odd hours, 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and that Luca always answered on the first ring, his voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. One Tuesday night, unable to sleep, she crept onto the landing of the grand staircase. The foyer below was dimly lit, the front door opened, and 3 men walked in. They were not the polished security detail that patrolled the perimeter. These men looked rough, their clothes rumpled and stained. One of them was clutching his side, a dark, wet patch spreading across his ribs. Another had a face that was a swollen map of purple and blue bruises. Luca met them at the foot of the stairs. He did not look alarmed. He looked disappointed. He spoke to them in Italian, his words sharp and clipped. He pointed toward the kitchen, where she knew the first aid supplies were kept, and then he handed the uninjured man a thick envelope. The transaction was smooth, practiced, and terrifyingly casual. The next day, she was in the garden, pruning a rose bush just to have something to do with her hands. When a police cruiser rolled up to the iron gates, Hila froze, her heart hammering. She expected sirens, shouting, and an arrest. Instead, the uniformed officer rolled down his window. Luca walked down the driveway, hands in his pockets. The officer said something, laughed, and touched the brim of his cap in a gesture of deferential respect. Luca nodded, handed the officer a box of cigars through the window, and the cruiser drove away. Hila watched from behind the trellis, a chill settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the wind. The police did not arrest Luca Belanti. They saluted him. The isolation and the mounting tension came to a head on a Friday night. A storm was battering Chicago, the wind howling against the reinforced glass of the library windows. Isla, restless and feeling the walls closing in, wandered downstairs. She found Luca in the library. The room was shadowed. lit only by the dying embers of a fire in the hearth and a single brass reading lamp. Luca was standing by the window, staring out into the black void of the storm. He held a tumbler of amber whiskey in one hand, his knuckles white around the glass. He had discarded his suit jacket, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and scarred skin. He did not turn when she entered, but she knew he sensed her. "You should be asleep," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I could say the same to you," Isla replied, stepping further into the room. The carpet swallowed the sound of her footsteps. "Sleep is a luxury I cannot always afford." He took a sip of the whiskey, the liquid catching the firelight. Isla moved toward the towering bookshelves that lined the wall opposite him. "I just wanted a book. The ones upstairs." "I finished them. Help yourself," he murmured. She scanned the spines, her eyes landing on a leather-bound volume of poetry on a shelf just above her eye level. She reached for it. At the same moment, Luca moved. He had crossed the room silently, intending to refill his glass at the decanter on the shelf below. They reached at the same time. His hand brushed hers. The contact was electric. It was a sudden, sharp jolt that made Isla gasp and pull her hand back as if she had been burned. Luca froze. He did not pull away. His hand hovered in the air where hers had been a second before. He turned his head slowly to look at her. The distance between them was less than a foot. Isla could smell the whiskey on his breath, mixed with that signature scent of sandalwood and rain. She looked up into his eyes and saw the mask gone. In its place was a raw, hungry intensity that terrified her and made her knees weak in equal measure. The air in the room seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and hard to breathe. Luca's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. His chest rose and fell with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Isla felt a magnetic pull, a terrifying urge to step closer, to close the gap and see if the fire in his eyes burned as hot as it looked. "Isla," he whispered. Her name sounded like a prayer and a warning in his deep voice. Panic flared in her chest, not fear of him, but fear of herself, of the situation, of the overwhelming complication of wanting a monster. I changed my mind," she stammered. She stepped back, nearly tripping over the hem of her long nightgown. She turned and fled the room, leaving the book on the shelf and Luca standing alone in the firelight. She ran to her room, threw on a pair of jeans and a sweater, and shoved her few belongings into a tote bag. She could not do this. She could not live in this house. Eating his food, wearing his clothes, and feeling this dangerous pull toward a man who paid off cops and patched up hitmen in his kitchen. It was insane. She marched downstairs, bypassing the library, and headed for the front door. She opened it and stepped out into the storm. The wind whipped her hair across her face, blinding her. She put her head down and walked toward the massive iron gates at the end of the driveway. She reached the keypad mounted on the stone pillar. She punched in the code she had seen the delivery drivers use. Nothing happened. A red light blinked. She tried again, denied. "Open!" she screamed at the machine, hammering the buttons. "Open! It will not open for you. Isla!" She spun around. Luca was standing 10 feet away, oblivious to the rain soaking his white shirt, plastering it to his skin. He looked like a statue carved from sorrow and granite. "Let me out," she shouted over the wind. "I want to go home." "You don't have a home," Luca said. He walked toward her, not threateningly, but with an unstoppable momentum. "And if you walk out that gate, you won't make it a mile." "I will take my chances." Isla backed up against the cold metal of the gate. "I am not your prisoner. Luca, you can't keep me here. I am not keeping you here to control you," he said, his voice rising for the first time, cutting through the sound of the thunder. "I am keeping you here because your landlord sold you out." Isla stopped fighting the gate. She stared at him, water dripping from her eyelashes. "What?" Luca stopped a few feet from her. He wiped rain from his eyes. "When you didn't come back that night, he didn't just change the locks. He made a call. He called the people your father owed money to. He told them you had come into some cash, that you were holding out. He reported you missing to the police as a cover, but he gave your description to the Bratva. Isla felt the blood drain from her face. The Bratva, the Russian mob, the men her father had screamed about in his sleep before the arrest. He wouldn't, she whispered. He did, Luca said. For $5,000, if you leave this estate, they will find you, and they will not be as polite as I have been. Isla slumped against the bars of the gate, the fight draining out of her. She slid down until she was sitting on the wet gravel, putting her head in her hands. Luca knelt in front of her. He did not touch her. He simply shielded her from the wind with his body. I took care of the landlord, he said quietly. Isla looked up, her eyes wide. What did you do? He's at St. Mary's Hospital, Luca said, his face devoid of emotion. He will be eating through a straw for the next 6 weeks. He won't be making any more calls. Isla shuddered. She should be horrified. She knew she should be horrified. But beneath the horror was a dark, twisted thread of relief. Someone had hurt the man who had tormented her. Someone had struck back. Come inside, Luca said, standing up and offering her his hand. You are freezing. Isla looked at his hand, the hand that had likely put a man in the hospital earlier that day. She took it. The truce that followed was fragile. Isla stayed, but the dynamic had shifted. She knew now that she was safe from the world outside, but she was sharing a cage with a lion. 2 nights later, the panic attack hit. It started with a noise, a branch snapping against her window in the wind. To Isla's sleeping brain, it sounded like a fist pounding on wood. It sounded like the night the police kicked down her front door. It sounded like the debt collectors screaming her father's name. She woke up gasping, her heart hammering a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The room was dark, shrinking around her. The shadows in the corners transformed into men in trench coats. She couldn't breathe. Her throat felt like it was closing up. She scrambled out of bed, tangling in the sheets. She needed to hide. She needed to get small. She ran to the walk-in closet, stumbling into the rows of hanging clothes. She pushed her way to the very back, behind the long winter coats, and curled into a ball on the floor. She pressed her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth, squeezing her eyes shut. No, 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 she whimpered, the air coming in short, shallow gasps. Please go away, please. She didn't hear the bedroom door open. She didn't hear the footsteps crossing the floor. Suddenly, light flooded the closet. Isla cried out, flinching away, trying to burrow into the wall. Isla? The voice was low and laced with genuine alarm. Luca. He was kneeling at the entrance of the closet. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair messy from sleep. He saw her curled in the corner, shaking violently, and his expression crumbled. Hey, he said softly, holding his hands up where she could see them. It is just me. It is Luca. You are safe. They are coming, Isla choked out, tears streaming down her face. They are at the door. No one is at the door, Luca said firmly. He moved closer, slow and steady, like approaching a frightened animal. The gates are locked. The guards are outside. No one gets to you without going through me. He reached her. He didn't grab her. He sat down on the floor next to her, his long legs cramping in the small space. He leaned his back against the wall, his shoulder pressing firmly against hers. Breathe with me, he commanded gently. In, out. Isla tried, but her lungs were spasming. She clutched at his arm, her fingers digging into his bicep. He didn't flinch. He covered her hand with his own, his palm warm and rough. I can't, she gasped. You can, he said. He shifted, turning so he could pull her into his chest. Listen to my heart. Match it. He wrapped his arms around her, enveloping her in his warmth. Isla buried her face in the crook of his neck, sobbing. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart against her cheek. It was slow, calm, an anchor in the storm of her panic. They sat there for a long time, huddled among the silk dresses and wool coats. Slowly, the terror began to recede, replaced by exhaustion and a keen awareness of the man holding her. Isla's breathing evened out. She pulled back slightly, wiping her wet face with her sleeve. She was sitting in his lap, her legs draped over his. It was an incredibly intimate position. She looked up at him. In the dim light of the closet, his eyes were bottomless. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was agonizingly tender. "Better?" he asked softly. Isla nodded. She didn't want to move. She felt safe here, wrapped in his strength. Luca shifted, lifting her effortlessly into his arms as he stood up. He carried her out of the closet and into the bedroom, walking to the velvet chaise lounge near the window rather than the bed. He sat down, keeping her on his lap, refusing to let go. Isla rested her head against his shoulder, her exhaustion making her heavy. She turned her face inward, her lips brushing against the sharp line of his jaw. Luca went still. Isla froze. The contact had been accidental, but neither of them pulled away. The heat that had flared in the library returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't just attraction, it was gratitude and safety and a desperate need for connection. She lifted her head. Their faces were inches apart. Luca's gaze dropped to her mouth. His hand tightened on her waist. The air crackled. He leaned in, just a fraction of an inch, his breath ghosting over her lips. Isla's heart hammered, not from panic, but from anticipation. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to forget the debt collectors and the fear and lose herself in him. But then the memory of the violence, the man in the hospital, the bruised men in the hall flashed in her mind. This was Luca Bellanti. He was death and violence wrapped in a beautiful suit. She turned her face away, burying it back in his shoulder. The moment hung suspended, fragile as glass. Then she felt Luca let out a long, shaky breath. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, chaste, protective, lingering. "Thank you," she whispered into his shirt, "for finding me." Luca rested his chin on her hair, his arms holding her as if he was trying to keep the world from breaking her apart. "You don't need to thank me," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I just want you to feel safe." They stayed like that until dawn broke, the Mafia boss and the girl with the broken life, watching the sun rise over a city that wanted to destroy them both. The silence in the Bellanti mansion had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a tomb, but the comfortable, companionable silence of a library or a church. The air, once thick with unsaid threats and fear, now carried the scent of fresh coffee and burning oak logs. Winter had fully descended on Chicago, turning the estate's sprawling grounds into a monochrome landscape of black iron and white snow. Isla and Luca had established a routine that hovered on the edge of domesticity, terrifyingly fragile, yet undeniably real. They walked the perimeter of the private gardens in the mornings, bundled in wool coats, their breath misting in the freezing air. They didn't touch, but they walked close enough that their sleeves brushed with every step. Luca was still a man of few words, but the wall of ice he had erected between them was beginning to thaw. He would pour her coffee before she reached for the pot. He would leave the best sections of the newspaper on the breakfast table for her. He started coming home earlier. One afternoon, they were sitting in the sunroom, the glass walls protecting them from the biting wind outside. Isla was reading, curled up in an armchair, while Luca reviewed a stack of documents with a frown etched between his brows. "You never talk about your family," Isla said, lowering her book. "Not the men in the suits. Your real family." Luca didn't look up immediately. His pen hovered over the paper. For a moment, Isla thought he would ignore her, or worse, tell her it was none of her business. But he capped the pen and set it down, leaning back in his chair. He looked out at the snow-covered hedges. "There is not much to talk about," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "My father died of a heart attack when I was 20. The business killed him, just slowly. The stress ate him from the inside out." "And your mother?" Isla asked softly. Luca's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered in his cheek. He turned his gaze to her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it made Isla want to look away. "My mother was a saint," he said. "She hated this life. She begged my father to leave it every day. She wanted to move to the coast, open a bakery. She smelled like yeast and vanilla." He paused, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the arm of his chair. She was killed when I was 12. We were leaving a church service. A rival family decided that Sunday morning was the perfect time to send a message. It was a drive-by. Crossfire. Isla gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Luca! I wasn't hit, he continued, as if reciting a police report, but she pushed me down. She took 3 bullets that were meant for the space I was standing in. She died on the pavement before the ambulance arrived. The room fell silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. That is why you live like this, Isla whispered, the realization dawning on her. The walls, the cameras, the distance. I made a vow, Luca said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. I swore I would never let another woman close enough to be used against me. I swore I would never be the reason someone else got hurt. Love, in my world, is just a target painted on someone's back. Isla looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the boy who had watched his mother die, hiding inside the man who now ruled the city with an iron fist. It must be lonely, she said, protecting everyone but yourself. Luca looked at her, his dark eyes burning with a strange, intense light. I have gotten used to the quiet. 3 nights later, the quiet was shattered. Isla was in the kitchen making tea when the side door burst open. 2 of Luca's men half carried, half dragged him inside. He was upright, but he was favoring his left leg, and his white dress shirt was soaked in crimson on the right side. Get the medical kit, one of the men shouted, his face pale. Isla dropped the mug. It shattered on the floor, ceramic shards skittering across the marble. She didn't even hear it. She ran to them. What happened? She demanded, grabbing a roll of paper towels from the counter. Ambush, Luca gritted out. His face was gray, beaded with sweat, but his eyes were clear. I am fine. Just a graze. It is not a graze, boss, the guard argued. You need stitches. I am not going to a hospital, Luca snarled. Get out. Leave the kit. The men hesitated, looking from their boss to Isla. Go, Isla said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. I will do it. The men left, clearly relieved to not be the ones stitching up the dawn. Isla helped Luca to the kitchen island, helping him shed his ruined jacket. He hissed in pain as he peeled off the blood-soaked shirt. Isla's hands shook as she opened the first aid kit, but she forced them to steady. The wound was a deep slice across his ribs, nasty, but clean. It had missed the vital organs. This is going to hurt, she warned, soaking a cotton pad in antiseptic. Luca laughed, a dry, humorless sound. I have had worse. She pressed the pad to the wound, his entire body seized, the muscles of his abdomen contracting hard, but he didn't make a sound. Isla worked quickly, cleaning the blood away. She was hyper-aware of his skin, the heat radiating from him, the intricate tapestry of scars that mapped his history of violence across his torso. You really need to work on your conflict resolution skills, Isla mumbled, trying to keep her voice steady as she threaded the needle. Most people just write a sternly worded email. Luca looked down at her. She was focused on his ribs, her brow furrowed in concentration. I tried that, he murmured. They didn't have a suggestion box. Isla let out a wet, nervous laugh. She looked up, and her breath hitched. He was watching her with an expression of such restrained hunger that it felt like a physical touch. He wasn't looking at her like a nurse. He was looking at her like a man who had been starving for a decade and had just found a feast. Isla, he said, his voice rough. Don't move, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Almost done. She finished the stitches and taped a bandage over the wound. Her fingers lingered on his skin for a fraction of a second too long before she pulled away. There, she said, stepping back. You will live. Luca didn't thank her. He just watched her, his eyes dark and unreadable. As she cleaned up the bloody towels, the air in the kitchen was thick with things unsaid, charging the space between them with electricity. Isla couldn't sleep. The image of Luca sitting on the kitchen stool, shirtless and bleeding, was burned into her retinas. She tossed and turned for hours, tangling herself in the high thread count sheets until the clock read 3 a.m. She knew he was awake. She could feel it. The house felt restless, vibrating with the same tension that was coiling in her gut. She got out of bed. She didn't put on a robe. She wore a simple silk slip, pale gray and trimmed with lace. She walked down the dark hallway, her bare feet silent on the carpet. She reached the double doors of the master suite. They were ajar. She pushed one open. The room was massive, dominated by a king-sized bed and a wall of windows that overlooked the frozen lake. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the snow. Luca was standing by the window. He was still shirtless, the bandage stark white against his tanned skin. He was staring out at the darkness, one hand resting high on the glass. He didn't turn when she entered. "Go back to bed. Isla?" "No," she said. The single word hung in the air. Luca turned slowly. The moonlight cut across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the depth of his eyes. "You don't know what you are doing," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you, I am not a good man. I will ruin you." Isla walked toward him. She didn't rush. She moved with a deliberate, terrifying certainty. "You saved me," she said. "You put a roof over my head. You fought for me. That doesn't sound like a bad man." She stopped 2 feet away from him. Up close. The energy radiating off him was overwhelming. He smelled of soap and copper and man. "I'm trying to protect you," he rasped. "From my enemies. From myself. I don't want to be protected right now," Isla whispered. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating hard. A heavy, rhythmic thud against her palm. Luca's control shattered. He let out a low, guttural sound and closed the distance between them. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with reverence. He looked at her as if he wanted to memorize her, to carve her image into his soul. "Isla," he groaned. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't the tentative, accidental brush of lips they had almost shared in the library. This was a claim. It was slow, deep, and aching with a need that had been suppressed for weeks. His lips were firm, moving against hers with a mix of dominance and desperation. Isla melted into him, her hands sliding up his bare arms to wrap around his neck, pulling him closer. He tasted like whiskey and sorrow. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was the only air left in the world. His hand slid down her back, pulling her flush against his hips, and Isla gasped at the contact, the heat of him searing through the thin silk of her slip. He broke the kiss to bury his face in her neck, inhaling sharply. "I have wanted to do that since the moment you fell asleep on my shoulder," he admitted, his voice a rough vibration against her skin. He swept her up into his arms, mindful of his ribs but ignoring the pain. He carried her to the bed and laid her down on the dark sheets. He hovered over her, bracing his weight on his arms. He paused, his eyes searching hers, giving her one last chance to run. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice ragged. Isla reached up and ran her fingers through his dark hair. "Yes." He lowered himself onto her. The rest of the world fell away. There was no mafia, no debts, no danger. There was only the friction of skin on skin, the sound of ragged breathing, and the overwhelming relief of two broken people finally fitting their jagged edges together. It was passionate, yes, but it was also reverent. Every touch was a promise. Every kiss was an apology for the years they had spent alone. The morning sun was blinding. It streamed through the uncurtained windows, bathing the room in gold. Isla woke slowly. She was warm. A heavy arm was draped over her waist, holding her fast. She turned her head. Luca was asleep beside her, his face younger and softer in repose than she had ever seen it. The lines of stress were smoothed out. The perpetual frown was gone. She watched him for a long time, tracing the line of his jaw with her eyes. She felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet stillness that settled in her bones. Luca stirred. His eyes opened, blinking against the light. For a second, he looked confused. Then he saw her, and a slow, lazy smile spread across his face. It was a true smile, one that reached his eyes. "Morning," he rasped, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," Isla whispered. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "You look different," he said softly. "Exhausted?" she teased, echoing his first words to her. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Peaceful." He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "You deserve peace, Isla, more than anyone I know." For an hour, they stayed in that bubble. They lay tangled together, talking about nothing, the weather, the books she had read, the type of coffee he liked. It was mundane and magical. But the world outside the gates did not care about their peace. A sharp knock on the bedroom door shattered the moment. "Boss?" It was the voice of Enzo, Luca's second in command. "I need a word. It is urgent." Luca's face hardened instantly. The lover vanished. The dawn returned. He sat up, wincing as his ribs protested, and reached for his discarded trousers. "5 minutes," Luca called out. He dressed quickly, his movements stiff. He turned to Isla, his expression regretful. "Stay here. I will see what it is." Isla sat up, pulling the sheet around her, a sudden cold dread settling in her stomach. She waited 10 minutes, then 20. She couldn't just sit there. She dressed in the clothes she had left on the floor and cracked the door open. Luca and Enzo were standing in the hallway, their voices low and urgent. "We intercepted a call," Enzo was saying, holding a tablet. "The Greeks are moving. They bought the debt portfolio from the collection agency your girl's father used." "Bought it?" Luca asked sharply. "And why? It is garbage debt, pennies on the dollar." "Because of the girl," Enzo said. "They know she is here. Luca, they know you have taken her in. They are going to use the debt to force her out. They are claiming legal ownership of her father's liabilities to get a warrant, or worse. They are going to leak her location to the cartels her father stole from. They are using her as leverage to get to you." Isla stepped back, the door clicking shut. She couldn't breathe. The bubble had not just popped, it had been obliterated. She was the weakness. She was the target painted on his back, just like he had said. By staying here, she wasn't just endangering herself. She was handing his enemies a weapon to destroy him. The man who had saved her. The man she loved. She couldn't let that happen. She moved with frantic haste. She grabbed her tote bag. She didn't pack clothes. She just grabbed her wallet and the few dollars she had left. She needed to go. If she wasn't here, they couldn't use her against him. She ran down the back servant's stairs, heart pounding in her throat. She reached the kitchen door and burst out into the cold morning air. She sprinted toward the side gate, the snow crunching under her boots. "Open," she prayed, reaching for the latch. "Please be open. Isla!" The shout tore through the air. She fumbled with the latch, tears freezing on her cheeks. "No, no, no." A hand clamped around her arm. It wasn't rough, but it was unbreakable. Luca spun her around. He was wearing only a shirt and trousers, no coat against the freezing wind. His face was a mask of panic and fury. "Where do you think you are going?" he demanded, shaking her slightly. "Let me go," Isla screamed, struggling against his grip. "I heard them. Luca, I heard Enzo. I am a liability. They are going to use me to hurt you." "I have to leave." "You are not leaving," Luca roared, pulling her flush against him. "Stop fighting me. I am just a waitress," Isla sobbed, her resistance breaking. She slumped against his chest, clutching his shirt. "I am just in debt. I am going to get you killed, just like your mother. I can't be that for you. I can't." Luca went still. He grabbed her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were fierce, blazing with a terrifying intensity. "You are not a debt," he said, his voice shaking with the force of his emotion. "And you are not a waitress. Not anymore. You are mine, Luca. Please." "No," he cut her off. "I spent 20 years building walls to keep people out. I am not letting you walk out of them now. I don't care who comes for us. I don't care about the Greeks or the cartels." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "Let them come," he whispered, a dark promise that sent shivers down her spine. "I will burn the city to the ground before I let them take you. I settle debts, Isla, and I am going to settle yours. Permanently." He scooped her up into his arms, ignoring her protests, and turned back toward the mansion. He carried her over the threshold, kicking the heavy door shut behind them, locking the world out and locking her in. The Bellanti estate had transformed from a sanctuary into a prison. The iron gates remained shut, bolstered by additional chains, and men with grim faces and earpieces patrolled the perimeter in tight, shifting patterns. The windows were covered, plunging the mansion into a perpetual twilight that messed with Isla's sense of time. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an intruder. Inside, the air was thick enough to choke on. Luca was operating on a frequency of controlled fury that made him terrifying to be around. He spent his hours in the command center he had set up in the West Wing, surrounded by maps, monitors, and lieutenants who spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Isla felt less like a guest and more like a piece of contraband being hidden from customs. She paced the length of the library, her reflection in the darkened glass looking pale and drawn. She was the cause of this. She knew it. The Greeks, the rival families, the sudden escalation. It was all because her father's debts had made her a pawn on a chessboard she didn't understand. Enzo, Luca's second in command, walked past the open library door, talking into a satellite phone. Isla caught a snatch of the conversation. "Thorne is the link," Enzo was saying, his voice low. "He was Moreno's bookkeeper. We found him in a safe house on the south side. He's selling the debt ledgers to the Greeks. If they get those ledgers, they have legal leverage to freeze Luca's legitimate assets, claiming they are tied to Moreno's fraud." Isla stepped out into the hall, her heart sinking. It wasn't just about her physical safety anymore. Her existence here was threatening to dismantle the empire Luca had spent his life building. She found Luca in the kitchen an hour later. He was staring at a tablet, a mug of black coffee untouched beside him. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deepened by sleeplessness. "We need to talk," Isla said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Luca looked up. For a second, his face softened, but he quickly reassembled the mask of the dawn. "Not now. Isla, things are moving fast. That is exactly why we need to talk," she insisted, walking around the island to stand across from him. "I heard Enzo. They are coming for your assets. They are using me to tear you down." "I will handle Enzo," Luca said darkly. "He speaks too loud." "Stop protecting me," Isla snapped, slamming her hand down on the marble counter. "Look at this place. Luca, it is a siege. You are bleeding money and resources just to keep me behind a gate. It is not worth it." Luca stood up slowly, his height suddenly imposing in the small space. "I decide what is worth it." "I am a liability," Isla argued, tears pricking her eyes. "If I turn myself in, if I go to the police or even to the Greeks, this stops. You can cut ties. You can say you never knew who I was. You think they will let you walk?" Luca laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "The Greeks will use you until you are empty and then leave you in a ditch. And the police answer to the highest bidder in this district. At least you would be safe," Isla cried. "I can't be the reason you lose everything. Just let me go. Let me make the deal." Luca moved faster than she could react. He reached across the counter and grabbed her wrist, his grip bruising. He pulled her toward him, his eyes blazing with a terrifying intensity. "You are not a transaction," he hissed, his voice vibrating with rage. "You are not a poker chip I can just toss back into the pot to save my hand. Do you understand?" Isla stared at him, the heat of his grip searing her skin. She yanked her arm back, pulling free with a sharp gasp. "Then stop treating me like one," she shouted. "Stop moving me around like a piece of inventory. You keep me in the dark. You lock me in rooms. You make decisions for me. That is not protection. Luca, that is ownership." She turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen. Luca shouted her name, but she didn't stop. She ran up the back stairs, her chest heaving, needing to put walls between herself and the man who made her feel simultaneously cherished and suffocated. She intended to go to her room, but in her blind haste, she took a wrong turn on the second-floor landing and ended up in the hallway leading to Luca's private study. The door was slightly ajar. Isla slowed down. She'd never been there. It was the one room in the house that was strictly off-limits. She pushed the door open. The room was stark. smelling of leather and cigar smoke. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center, covered in stacks of files. On the wall behind the desk, a corkboard was filled with photos connected by red string, the visual map of the war he was fighting. Isla walked around the desk. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe proof that he was winning. Maybe proof that he wasn't. Her hand brushed against a pile of manila folders on the corner of the desk. The top one slid off and fell to the floor, spilling its contents. Isla knelt to pick it up. She froze. The first photograph was of her. It wasn't a recent photo. It was from 6 months ago. She was walking out of the university library, wearing a coat she had sold weeks ago. She picked up the next photo. It was her father, shaking hands with a man she didn't recognize. The next was a copy of her birth certificate. Isla's breath caught in her throat. She gathered the papers with shaking hands. There was a dossier, a background check, a surveillance log. She read the dates, October 14th, November 2nd. The dates were from 3 months ago, long before she had fallen asleep on the train, long before she had met Luca Belanti. She flipped to the summary page. In Luca's handwriting, sharp and angular, were notes in the margins. Arthur Moreno, fraud investigation, daughter Ila Moreno. Leverage point, the room spun. It was a lie. All of it. The chance encounter on the train, the kindness, the rescue. It wasn't fate. It was a calculation. He hadn't helped her because he was a good man or because she looked tired. He had helped her because he had been stalking her family for months. She was just a loose end he had decided to tie up. Isla. She stood up, clutching the file to her chest. Luca was standing in the doorway. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked resigned. Isla backed away until her legs hit the leather chair. She held up the file, her hand trembling so hard the papers rattled. "You knew," she whispered. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to the stomach, making her nauseous. "You knew who I was." Luca walked into the room. He didn't try to deny it. He didn't look at the file. He looked at her face. "I was investigating your father," he said calmly. "He stole $4 million from a holding company I own. I needed to find him. I needed to know where the money went. You were part of the investigation." "Part of the investigation?" Isla's voice cracked. "I was a target. Leverage point. That is what you wrote." "That was before," Luca said, taking a step forward. "Before what?" Isla screamed. She threw the file at him. Papers scattered across the Persian rug like dead leaves. "Before you decided to play the hero? Before you manipulated me into your car? Was the thug on the street one of yours, too? Did you stage the whole thing just to get me into your house?" "No," Luca said, his voice hard. "The attack was real. The train was real. How can I believe you?" Tears streamed down her face, hot and angry. "You told me you helped me because you didn't like seeing women sleep on trains. You lied." "I didn't lie," Luca said. "I just didn't tell you the whole truth." Isla marched up to him. The grief and the love and the fear boiled over into a singular moment of rage. She slapped him. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a gunshot. Isla's palm stung. Luca's head turned to the side, but he didn't raise a hand to stop her. He stood there, accepting the blow, his jaw tight. "So this was all a setup?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "The breakfast, the clothes, the night in your bed. Was it all just to keep your leverage close?" Luca turned his head back to look at her. His eyes were hollow. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything," he said, his voice low and rough. "I tracked you to the train that night to confront you. I was going to scare you into telling me where your father hid the money. That was the plan." He took a breath, looking at her with a devastating vulnerability. "Then you fell asleep," he whispered. "You looked so tired. You looked like you were carrying the weight of the world, and I didn't want to wake you." Isla stared at him. The admission hung in the air, tragic and insufficient. It didn't fix the lie. It didn't erase the fact that their foundation was built on surveillance photos and stolen money. "I can't do this," she choked out. "I can't be here." She ran. She pushed past him, sprinting out of the study. She heard him call her name, but she didn't stop. She ran down the stairs, ignoring the startled looks of the guards in the foyer. She needed air. She needed to be away from him, away from the lies. She burst out the front door. The cold air hit her like a wall, shocking her lungs. She ran down the driveway, slipping on patches of ice. "Miss Moreno!" a guard by the fountain shouted. "Stop!" She ignored him. She reached the service gate on the east side of the property, a smaller exit used by the groundskeepers. It was keypad locked. She had seen the code entered a dozen times. 2, 4, 6, 8. It beeped green. The lock clicked. Isla pushed it open and stumbled out onto the public road. The snow was deeper here, uncleared. She trudged through it, her sneakers soaking through instantly. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked. Blinded by tears, her breath coming in ragged sobs, she made it less than 200 yards. A gray van screeched around the bend, sliding on the ice before correcting itself. It didn't pass her. It slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt right beside her. The side door flew open. Isla's survival instincts kicked in too late. She turned to run, but boots hit the pavement. 2 men in balaclavas jumped out. "Grab her!" one of them shouted. Isla screamed. She swung her arms wildly, her fist connecting with a jaw, but they were too strong. Heavy hands grabbed her waist, her hair. She was lifted off her feet. "Let me go!" she shrieked. Kicking out, they dragged her toward the open door of the van. The interior was dark, a black void waiting to swallow her. She grabbed the door frame, her fingernails scraping against the metal. "Get her in!" the driver yelled. A gunshot cracked through the air. The man holding Isla's legs grunted and collapsed, a hole appearing in his thigh. Isla fell to the asphalt, scraping her knees raw. She looked back. Enzo was standing at the open service gate, a smoking pistol in his hand. He was running toward them, shouting into his radio. The second attacker panicked. He grabbed Isla by the collar of her coat, trying to haul her up, using her as a shield. "Back off!" he screamed, pulling a knife. Then, a roar like a wounded animal tore through the silence. Luca. He didn't have a gun. He was sprinting down the road in his dress shoes, slipping and recovering with terrifying speed. He hit the man holding Isla like a freight train. The impact sent them both flying into the snowbank. Isla scrambled backward, crawling on the ice, gasping for air. Luca was on top of the man instantly. He didn't use technique. He didn't use the cold, calculated violence she had seen in the alley. This was pure, unadulterated rage. He punched the man in the face, the sound of bone cracking sickeningly loud. He hit him again, and again, and again. "You touched her!" Luca screamed, his voice breaking. He grabbed the man by the tactical vest and slammed him back into the frozen ground. "You touched her!" The man was unconscious, his face a ruin. But Luca didn't stop. His knuckles were raw and bleeding, his breath coming in savage heaves. "Luca!" Isla screamed. "Luca, stop! You're killing him!" Enzo reached them. He grabbed Luca by the shoulders, hauling him back with all his strength. Boss, it is done. He is down." Luca struggled for a second, his eyes wild, unseeing. Then slowly, the red haze seemed to clear. He stopped fighting. He looked down at the broken man in the snow. Then he looked at Isla. He scrambled out over to her, falling to his knees. He didn't care about the blood on his hands or the snow soaking his trousers. He grabbed her face, checking her frantically for injuries. "Did they hurt you?" he gasped, his voice wrecked. "Isla, look at me. Did they hurt you?" Isla was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. She looked at the man who had lied to her, the man who had tracked her father, the man who had just nearly beaten a kidnapper to death with his bare hands. "No," she whispered. "I am okay." Luca let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her so tightly it hurt. He buried his face in her neck, shaking uncontrollably. "I am sorry," he murmured into her skin. "I am so sorry." He didn't let her walk back. He stood up and lifted her into his arms, carrying her through the snow like she weighed nothing. Enzo stayed behind to deal with the gunman and the van, but Luca didn't look back. He carried her through the service gate, up the driveway and back into the warmth of the mansion. He didn't stop until they were in the living room. He sat down on the sofa, keeping her in his lap, refusing to let her go even for a second. He grabbed a throw blanket and wrapped it around her, tucking the edges in with trembling fingers. Isla watched him. His face was pale, splattered with specks of blood that weren't his. His eyes were haunted. "Why?" she whispered, her voice small in the large room. "After everything. After I slapped you. After I ran. Why do you keep saving me?" Luca looked at her. He reached out and touched her cheek, his hand hesitating, afraid he might stain her skin with the violence he carried. "Because," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of the truth, "the first time I lost everything." He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. "I watched my mother die because I froze," he whispered. "I stood there and I did nothing. I vowed I would never freeze again. I vowed I would never lose someone that mattered." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a desperate, terrifying love. "And you matter, Hila. You matter more than the money, more than revenge, more than the empire." Hila looked at him, the anger in her heart cooling into something aching and sad. She saw the boy who had lost his mother, terrified of history repeating itself. She realized that his control, his lies, his files, they were all just desperate attempts to build a fortress around a heart that had been broken 20 years ago. She reached out and took his battered hand in hers. She didn't forgive him, not yet, but she squeezed his fingers, anchoring him to the present. "I am still here," she whispered. Luca let out a long, shuddering breath and buried his face in her shoulder, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling down around them. The snow did not stop falling for 3 days. It buried the estate in a blanket of white silence, hiding the bloodstains on the driveway and covering the scars of the violence that had erupted at the service gate. But inside the mansion, the silence was heavy, fraught with a tension that felt like a held breath. Hila remained. She did not run again, but she did not fully return to him either. She moved through the house like a shadow, her interactions with Luca polite, functional, and agonizingly distant. She allowed him to check on her, to ensure she was warm, to sit across from her at dinner, but the wall was back up. She had seen the file. She knew that their beginning had been a calculation, and trust, once broken, was a bone that healed slowly and often crooked. Luca did not push her. He seemed to accept her distance as his penance. He slept in the guest room down the hall, giving her the master suite, leaving her alone with the ghosts of their short-lived intimacy. But while he was gentle with her, he was a tyrant to the world outside. The attack on Isla had shattered Luca's carefully maintained strategy of patience. He no longer cared about leverage or legal maneuvering. He wanted the threat gone. He wanted the earth scorched so thoroughly that nothing would ever grow in his path again. For 48 hours, Luca Bellanti waged a war that Chicago would talk about for decades. It was not a war of street shootouts, but a systematic, brutal dismantling of the Greek syndicate and the rival families that had allied with them. It played out on the evening news while Isla sat in the library, watching the television with a knot in her stomach. Luca released the blackmail files he had been hoarding for years. He leaked evidence of police corruption, money laundering schemes, and human trafficking rings run by his enemies. He handed the district attorney everything she needed to issue indictments that wiped out the entire upper leadership of the Greek organization in a single afternoon. But the victory came at a devastating cost, by exposing his enemies. Luca had exposed himself. He had stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding glare of the public eye. On the morning of the 4th day, the sirens came. Isla was drinking tea in the kitchen when the front gates were swarmed, not by hitmen, but by news vans and federal agents with search warrants. They didn't have enough to arrest Luca. He had insulated himself too well for that, but they tore the mansion apart. Uniformed agents swarmed the hallways, pulling books off shelves, seizing computers, and tagging furniture. The sanctuary was violated, the fortress was breached. Isla sat in the sunroom while an agent rifled through her purse. She felt exposed, raw and incredibly tired. Luca stood in the doorway, watching the agents with a look of cold detachment. He was dressed in a suit, impeccable as always, but there was a weariness in his posture that frightened her. When the agents finally left, carrying boxes of files that his lawyers would spend months fighting to suppress, the house felt hollowed out. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a ruin. Luca found her in the sunroom an hour later. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor. He was holding a thick manila envelope. He walked over to her and placed it on the low glass table. "What is this?" Isla asked, her voice raspy from disuse. "It is a way out," Luca said. He didn't look at her. He looked out at the trampled snow in the garden. "Inside is a passport with a new name. There is a bank account in Zurich with enough money to let you live comfortably for the rest of your life. There is a plane ticket to Paris departing tomorrow night." Isla stared at the envelope. It was everything she had screamed for in the snow. Freedom, safety, a life without debt collectors or gunshots. "The Greeks are finished," Luca continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "The threat is gone, but this—" He gestured to the empty shelves and the chaos of the house. "This life is going to get ugly. The media, the trials, the rebuilding. It is no place for you." He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were dark, resigned, and filled with a heartbreaking amount of love that he was trying desperately to suppress. "You were right. Isla, I tried to own you. I tried to keep you in a cage because I was terrified of losing you. I was selfish." He took a step back. "You are free. Go to Paris. Find peace." Isla reached out and touched the cool paper of the envelope. She traced the edge with her finger. She thought about Paris. She thought about walking down a street without looking over her shoulder. She thought about a normal life. Then she looked at Luca. She saw the man who had walked her home when she was a stranger. The man who had slept on the floor of a closet to help her breathe. The man who had just burned his own empire to the ground to ensure no one could ever hurt her again. "If I go," Isla said softly, "I will be safe." "Yes," Luca whispered. "But," she continued, standing up, she picked up the envelope. "I will spend every day wondering if you are alive. I will spend every night missing the sound of your voice." She looked him in the eye. "If I go, I will never stop looking back." She tore the envelope in half. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Luca flinched as if she had struck him. "Isla," he choked out, "don't be a fool. I am drowning. Don't drown with me." "I know how to swim," she said, stepping around the table to stand in front of him, "and I am not afraid of the water. I am afraid of a life without you in it." "Even after the file?" Luca asked, his voice raw. "Even after you know I lied?" "The file hurts," Isla admitted. She didn't sugarcoat it. "It hurts that you investigated me. It hurts that I was a target before I was a person to you." She reached out and took his hands. They were cold. "But you didn't use the leverage," she said firmly. "You had the file, Luca, and you never used it. You could have blackmailed me. You could have forced me to tell you about my father. Instead, you gave me a bed. You gave me food. You fought for me." She squeezed his hands. "The file was the plan," she whispered. "But falling in love with me? That wasn't in the file, was it?" Luca shook his head, his composure crumbling. "No, that was the only thing I didn't account for." "Then we start from there," Isla said. "We build on that, not on the lies, not on the fear, on the fact that you saved me and I saved you." Luca stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. "Come with me," he said. He led her out of the sunroom, through the ravaged house, and up a narrow flight of stairs she had never noticed before. It led to the roof. He opened the heavy steel door, and the winter air hit them instantly. It was snowing again. Soft. Fat flakes drifting down from a charcoal sky. The city of Chicago sprawled out before them, a grid of glittering lights in the distance. Beautiful and indifferent. It was freezing, but Luca didn't let her feel it. He unbuttoned his heavy wool overcoat and pulled her into him, wrapping the coat around her so they were cocooned together inside the warmth of the wool and his body. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped tight around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I can't promise you it will be easy," he murmured against her ear, My name is mud in the papers. Half my assets are frozen. The house is a crime scene. I don't care about the assets, Isla said, leaning back into him, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against her back. And I don't care about the house. It was never a home. Luca, it was a fortress. I want to give you a home, he said. I want to give you everything. You gave me safety, she reminded him. Now give me yourself. Luca turned her in his arms. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the snowflakes that caught on her eyelashes. He looked at her with a reverence that stopped her breath. I love you, he whispered. It was the first time he had said the words. They hung in the cold air, warm and absolute. Isla Moreno, I love you more than my own life. I love you. Luca, she whispered back. He kissed her. It wasn't the desperate, hungry kiss of the bedroom, nor the tentative first kiss in the library. This kiss was deep, slow, and whole. It was a seal on a promise. It tasted of winter air and forgiveness. It was the feeling of coming home after a long, dark journey. Snow swirled around them, dusting their hair white, but they didn't move. They stood on the roof of the broken fortress, holding each other up, two survivors who had finally found their harbor. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds. Isla woke up in the master bedroom. The bed was warm. For the first time in weeks, she had slept through the night without nightmares. She stretched, feeling the silk sheets against her skin, and listened. There was music playing, soft, slow jazz drifting up from downstairs, and there was a smell, bacon, coffee, and something sweet like cinnamon. She smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and crinkled the corners. It felt strange on her face, unused muscles remembering how to work. She dressed in one of Luca's oversized shirts and padded barefoot down the stairs. The kitchen was a disaster of flour and eggshells. Luca was at the stove, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, flipping pancakes with a look of intense concentration usually reserved for negotiating truces. He looked up when she entered. He smiled. It wasn't the smirk of the Mafia Don. It was just a man, happy to see a woman. I hope you like burnt edges, he said, gesturing to the stack on the plate. I am out of practice. I love burnt edges, Isla said, hopping up onto the counter. A sound came from the back door, a sharp, playful bark. Isla looked over. A large, scruffy dog, some kind of shepherd mix, was sitting by the glass door, tail wagging, nose pressed against the pane. Who is that? Isla asked, delighted. That is Brutus, Luca said, flipping another pancake. I found him at the shelter this morning when I went to get the milk. He looked exhausted. Isla laughed. It was a bright, clear sound that filled the kitchen. You have a type? Belanti? I like strays, he admitted, walking over to her. He stood between her knees, resting his hands on her waist. They are loyal. He kissed her quickly, tasting of coffee. Eat, he commanded gently. We have an appointment at noon. The drive took an hour. They left the city behind, the gray skyline fading in the rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and trees heavy with snow. They pulled up to a wrought iron gate, but this one wasn't ominous. It was decorative, covered in ivy. Behind it sat a house. It wasn't a mansion, it was a sprawling, two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and smoke curling lazily from a stone chimney. It was secluded, quiet, and surrounded by woods. A real estate agent was waiting by the front door, looking nervous to be meeting the infamous Luca Belanti, but holding her clipboard with professional determination. Isla stepped out of the car. The air here was clean. It smelled of pine and earth. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs. What is this? She asked. Luca walked around the car and took her hand. He looked at the house, then at her. It is far enough away that no one will bother us, he said, but close enough that I can still handle my business. He squeezed her hand. I am selling the estate, he said. I am done with fortresses. I want a home. I want a garden where you can plant things that grow. I want a kitchen where I can burn pancakes without the staff watching. Isla looked at the house. She could see it. She could see herself reading on the porch. She could see Brutus running in the snow. She could see Luca, older, grayer, sitting by that fire. "It is beautiful," she whispered. The agent waved at them, smiling tentatively. Luca turned to Isla. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He didn't give them to the agent. He pressed them into Isla's palm, closing her fingers over the cold metal. "Your name on the deed," Luca said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Mine on the gate." Isla looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. It was the perfect balance, her ownership, his protection, a partnership forged in fire and sealed in snow. She nodded, unable to speak. Luca leaned down and kissed her hand, right over the keys. "Welcome home, Isla." They walked up the path together, the snow crunching under their boots, hand in hand toward the blue front door. Fade to black. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Isla and Luca as much as I enjoyed writing it. Stories about redemption and finding love in the darkest of places are always special to create. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment down below letting me know where you are listening from. Are you tuning in from the US, the UK, the Philippines, India, or somewhere else entirely? It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this series, please make sure to subscribe to Mafia Romance Stories and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share your thoughts on the ending in the comments section. Did you like that Isla made him work for her forgiveness? Thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next story.